Hi, very good evening to everyone. My name is Zubin Daruwala and I'm the Health Industries Leader for PwC Singapore. Thank you very much for joining my fellow friends and colleagues this evening in our fourth of a four-part series that we host together with Catalyst every quarter. Today's session is going to be on mental health, I think a big problem, especially in the last 12 months given COVID. So I think before I let my fellow colleagues here introduce themselves, just share a little bit about what's happened. I think everyone's familiar with what's been happening over the last 12 to 18 months. COVID-19 has really led to a lockdown of almost all countries worldwide at some point in time. And during these periods, a multitude of reports have been released talking about the negative impact COVID and the repercussions of COVID have had on people's mental health. I think based on our very own PwC Global Health Survey, just taken a few months ago, and the Singapore cut of more than 1,000 respondents, almost a third of people in Singapore who responded said that they have suffered from mental health issues, anxiety, depression, and others. Globally, this was at 36%. So a big portion of our populations globally experiencing symptoms of mental health. So I think on that, I would love for my colleagues here to maybe introduce themselves and share a little bit about their companies. We have three great companies here, all based out of Singapore. So I will start with Maureen, ladies first, and then we'll move on to Teng Yan and Avidas. And if you just want to share, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Zubin. So Maureen Reid, so I'm the CEO and co-founder of Cogniant. And at Cogniant, we've patented a solution that allows patients to be tracked and monitored anytime and anywhere using digital biomarkers from their smartphone. To Zubin's point, I think that we've seen, a 400% increase in patients suffering from mental health, really seeking access to services and to care during COVID. And so we're focused about, supporting those individuals to be supported outside of the traditional clinical setting, and to ensure that all of their treatment is not reactive, but proactive in terms of monitoring and tracking and allowing those patients to be served in the best possible way in their home setting.
Great, thank you, Maureen. Teng Yan, go ahead.
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Teng Yan. I'm the Chief of Digital Therapeutics at Hallmas. Hallmas is a data science and healthcare company that's really focused on solving challenging problems in the mental health space. We fundamentally believe that there's no health without mental health. And we are building one of the world's largest real-world evidence platforms to really solve for problems in the behavioral health space, including conditions like major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, as well as Alzheimer's disease. Really excited to be here on the panel today.
Thank you. Avidas.
I'm Avidas Moradian. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Mobile Interactive. Mobile Interactive has built OmniTX, a clinically validated psychotherapy and performance enhancement application. When it comes to COVID, our focus, for example, clinically has always been with cancer patients. But I had a lot of friends in China who would message me these stories of the lockdown in Wuhan in December and January, and they would say things like, people would get on WeChat groups to talk to each other in order to keep up, and there was this necessity of delivering remote mental health. So we decided to jump on the case, in fact, around the time to retool our application to offer COVID-specific support to people that require it. So it's very much something that we've had to do.
Great, thank you, Avidas. So I guess maybe I'll ask the first question to all of you. Just jump in. Given what I started this session off with, right? Are there any general comments any of you guys have based on the figures and stats that you've seen just on mental health broadly? Because I think one of the key things we want to share with the audience, right, is to raise that awareness of mental health. It's still a stigma in Singapore and globally. So maybe some facts and figures that you might find interesting, any of you?
Sure, why don't I'll just kick things off. I think part of the reason why at Hallmas we've been working very hard on this problem over the last 6 years is that mental health and behavioral health is really going to be the cancer of tomorrow. If you look at the global spend in behavioral health and mental health conditions, it's close to $1 trillion of economic spend on a yearly basis. And that's even before the COVID pandemic. And this is fast catching up to cardiovascular conditions and oncology. But yet, if you look at the progress in this space over the last 15 to 20 years in terms of like the number of new treatments that have been developed in this space, it's really a lot slower than many other industries. And the reason for this is because there are many inherent challenges that goes in the mental health space. The various conditions in this space are very complex. They're often difficult to measure. There's no blood test or biomarker that really helps you to make a diagnosis or understand the severity of a patient in that particular condition. And the level of awareness in this space has been relatively low. And that's really what has been impeding a lot of progress in this space. And I think a lot of why we're doing the work we do is because we see that data science and analytics can really lay the foundation both for us to help understand how current treatments work, but really lay the foundation for a new generation of treatments in the future in the behavioral health space.
You mentioned biomarker not existing, I guess, until now, right? I'm sure your fellow panelists might have something to add to that. Any comments from either of you in terms of facts, figures, on how big a problem it is?
And to build on your point, I think that, we know that those being diagnosed with mental health, not only is it increasing, and it is definitely the cancer of tomorrow, we don't actually know the fallout of the COVID pandemic. So they said, COVID pandemic at the moment, there's hundreds of millions of people suffering from COVID and the cost is in the trillions, but actually what is the cost going to be post that pandemic in terms of the mental health cost? I think it's really hard to quantify, but at Cognient, we really understand that, those being diagnosed with mental health conditions, only 50% of them are actually compliant with their treatment at the moment. And we're here to hopefully increase that level of compliance, but also to understand that, we do that in a non-invasive, passive way. And to your point around biomarkers, yes, there is no blood test to diagnose someone with mental health conditions. But at Cognient, we use both real world evidence and also digital biomarkers to support relapse prediction. And we believe that in able to do that, we can intervene earlier, but hopefully, enable patients to not actually present to emergency departments or not actually relapse. And the cost for that is in the millions for hospitals, but also to individuals and insurers themselves.
Avi, any?
Yes, I'll continue on this very interesting thread. So the cost is in the trillions. If we look at second or third degree effects, the estimated cost in 2016 was 16 trillion globally, right? And beyond the ability to diagnose, there's a dearth of options available to treat mental illness. Like if we take psychotherapy, the cost can be from $2.5 to $25,000, and the effectiveness rate is 30%. It's inaccessible. It's very hard to access psychotherapy in person. When it comes to pharmacotherapy, the cost is $200 to $7.2 thousand USD, and again, 30% effectiveness rate with possible terrible side effects, of course. And when it comes to wellness tools, most of them haven't beaten placebo. So there's this lack of options that are available for people who may even seek to treat their mental conditions, or may even try to enhance their mental state. So when it comes to calculating and estimating using evidence in order to create effective psychotherapy in order to alleviate the illnesses in question, I think it's very important to have effective and robust psychobiometrics. One of the touchstones of our solution is that we use the front-facing camera of a handheld device to objectively measure stress levels. And we benchmark it before therapy, and then we do a measurement after a therapy. And what this allows us to do is to tailor the therapies to the individual, to personalize it. It's very nebulous. The data isn't always there, but being able to collect that data, being able to assess it, being able to use it effectively is very, very, very important.
I want to go a little bit off what you all have been talking about, but something that each of you have alluded to, cost, okay? And in fact, it's funny, just in the last week, I'm seeing a lot of things on social media talking about reimbursement and strategies for digital health and health tech companies. So one of the things that we often tell all our companies is that the reimbursement strategy is extremely important, okay? If you look at solutions, health tech solutions today, a lot of them, go to insurers, and in fact, a lot or almost all of them say we save money, right? The return on investment is worth it. So solutions today need to be either cost neutral and have a better outcome, or cost saving with a better outcome or the same outcome, right? What are your thoughts on this, and how have each of you tackled that? Is it an important topic, and is it something you guys focused on really early, reimbursement strategy and showing and validating that the cost and return on investment is there? Anyone?
I can go first.
Sure.
I think that's a really difficult question to answer. For a number of reasons. I think at Cogniant, we've always had the philosophy to not be 100% influenced by reimbursement models, because we know that reimbursement models are different by market that we operate in, and also there's an evolution around digital health, both from a regulatory perspective and then also a reimbursement model. Yeah. And we've seen, you know, changes to the reimbursement model around telehealth solution, but we don't play in that space. So for us, to your point around, are we influenced by reimbursement models? I feel like as a company, that hasn't been our primary focus in terms of building a solution and then also a business model that fits around that solution. But to be aware of that, it's extremely important depending on what market you're playing in, because regulatory and reimbursement is often entry points to that market. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll just share a little bit from our own experiences at Homas. So at Homas, I would say we do two main things, right? We're very much an enterprise-based business. One is that we actually have a data platform, and this data platform is actually used by pharmaceutical companies, researchers, clinicians. So that particular platform is less relevant, I think, in terms of from the reimbursement kind of perspective, as long as we are able to deliver value to researchers in terms of, for example, being able to conduct better, more efficient clinical trials, which is a huge spend in just to get one drug to the market. I think it's very easy to create a case, right? To say there's an ROI. By using this platform, you need less patients, you don't need a control group, we can create virtual control groups for you. I think that's a very powerful way. Another part of what we do in our business is really focused on our digital solutions, where these are actually solutions that are used by our end users, be it patients with mental health conditions, or say even upstream on a preventative approach, preventing people from getting to that mental health issue in the first place. I think eventually reimbursements needs to be there. I think that definitely is part of where we're thinking. But what we've seen, I think, at least over here in Asia, is that I think the business models around digital solutions are still very nascent, still to be developed. Many payers, pharma companies are interested in trying new things out. But what actually that model is going to be, I think is going to be a bit later on. Reimbursement really come when there's solid clinical data, when there's solid outcome data, which I would say, given that digital health has really only come into play in mental health probably only the last couple of years. It's probably going to be a couple more years before that goes into play. So we have to find other ways as well to get that revenue before reimbursement comes in.
Unless you have something urgent or important.
Well, if you want to follow up on
go ahead.
I could talk about reimbursement strategy, because it's something that we've pursued since the beginning. Right. We have a three-pronged go-to-market strategy, and one of the most important is, of course, reimbursement insurance methods. And as you mentioned, clinical trials are very important, and we pursued that early on in the company.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, we attacked and got our clinical validation early on. But to another point, which is regulators have to catch up as well. They have to create frameworks for regulatory compliance, which are in line with the rise of digital medicine. And we're very happy to go through the process without that, and we'll push through, and we'll do what is necessary to get people the treatments that they need. But it would be an enormous amount of help if the regulators could catch up with the technology itself.
Wish we had the regulator here today to provide input, but yeah, we'll follow up with that. But on clinical validation, both of you mentioned it, right? I mean, we're aware you guys were the first, or one of the first, to be the first clinically validated digital therapeutics, right? What about the two of you? I know that you guys have done clinical validation as well. Did you wish that you had done it earlier? Do you think it's important for the other health tech companies listening in? How early should you do it? And did you find it a challenge to actually get onto clinical trials?
I go first. I'll just share my own personal thoughts, and it actually is a tension in my head between two aspects of it. I think one is that, I mean, just to share, for example, we have a digital suite of tools that's targeted at patients with major depressive disorder, which comprises of a mobile application that patients use to track their health in an active and passive way, but also a clinician dashboard that provides clinical decision support. So currently, this suite of solutions, we're actually undergoing clinical trials at 2 centers in the US, as well as in Beijing Anding Hospital, which is one of the largest psychiatric hospitals in China. So the challenge with clinical trials is that I think it takes time. It takes a lot of time to gather the amount of data to be able to say that, okay, this actually works, right? And if you look at how typically from a drug to market is typically like 13 to 17 years. Even for a digital product, it's at least several years ago. So I think where clinical trials come in, I think it needs to be determined by what the indication is, what the use case is. So for example, if something is there to provide really diagnosis, clinical decision support, yes, then I'm sure that level of validation is required. But I think there are a lot of very useful mental health tools as well that don't actually require that level of evidence to be able to go to market, because the risks of such tools are very little.
Example?
Say a mobile application that, say, guides you through mindfulness, guides you through certain habits, links you up with, say, a personal counselor through the app that guides you, helps you develop habits to build your level of mental resilience. I think those are things that don't actually require a clinical trial. And even just recently in the last year in the US FDA said that for digital tools that were treating psychiatric conditions, you actually don't need to file a 410K to actually go to market. You can actually go out there and later on, let's see what the data is and what the evidence is. Just because the risk level for some of these products goes. So I think it really depends.
To that point though, do you think that there was a push from the market last year to get tools out, and then they're hoping that there's a parallel thing happening where they want tools in the market, so then they're happy to make sure that they have minimum risk, but ultimately they were going to a point where there is going to be, you know, a significant amount of evidence to show that that they're either, you know, impactful, or that they're, you know, benefiting patient outcomes, or do you see that as potentially where it's heading?
I think so. I think everyone's still also trying to figure out, even the regulators, to be honest. And I'm not sure whether you had the same experience before, but I feel like trying to conduct a clinical trial on a digital solution is extremely challenging. How do you show an effectiveness that is greater than placebo? I think it's often not easy. How do you actually design? I'll be actually very curious.
Well, we designed our placebo actually, and there are some discussions around what the placebo would be. In one of our trials, for example, we used a cognitive training activity in the same format that we deliver our psychotherapy. And the cognitive training, again, was benchmarked with the tools that we have.
Okay.
And in that case, and there was also suggested to participants that this is an effective solution in some ways. So we're actually trying to accentuate the placebo effect in some ways to make sure that we're really beating it in this case. So we designed our own placebo, and once we were able to beat it, we knew then that there's at least a sufficient level of evidence to suggest efficiency. Effectively, sorry.
Because we're starting from zero, right? Like there's not a huge amount of evidence out there. I think with Cognient, we've got 5 clinical trials at the moment, 2 of which are in Singapore, which we're really super proud about being incorporated here. One's at Institute of Mental Health and the other one's at Tan Tock Seng. You know, to your point around just the amount of effort and approvals that need to go into clinical trials, they're just long cycles, right? And especially, I mean, we believe we're one of the first in Institute of Mental Health to use a digital medicine company to come in and do a clinical trial there around relapse prediction. In saying that, at Cognient, we believe that is, as a company philosophy of how we wanted to actually grow our foundations, was that we needed clinical validation, and aggressively we pursued clinical validation. Because not only do we see that as a differentiator in the market, but we see it, you know, the conversations, I've talked to 3 biopharma companies in the last couple of days, and each one of them have asked me about what is, you know, and we're still in early stage of actually publishing some of those results. but what has been the results? What is the accuracy around that? They're much more interested than they were even 6 to 12 months ago. The conversations are much more targeted at like, what is your clinical validation to support us potentially taking a gamble on you going forward?
I mean, I don't think you can get away from clinical validation in anything in medicine, right? My question, yes or no, do you think virtual clinical trials, because there are a few solutions now globally coming out, very interesting solutions, some really good ones out of UK and academic institutions in London. Yes or no, do you think virtual clinical trials will replace traditional clinical trials? And if yes, in what time frame? Yes or no?
I would say yes, for sure. I feel like clinical trials was very archaic. And
time frame, yes, and
time frame. Give it 5 years.
Maureen?
Yes, in 5 years.
Yes, in 5 years.
With the disclosure, sorry, that I think that some therapeutic areas will still need to have traditional trials, but there'll be a lot that will go onto a clinical platform.
Not my area of expertise, but my personal guess, based on my work experience, would be yes as well.
What time frame do you think?
That I wouldn't be able to answer.
Okay. It's interesting because there are a number of clinically validated digital twins of the human body that exist globally that have helped speed up research in academia. So it'll be interesting to watch this space. I guess let's move on a little bit away from clinical trials. I think one topic that everybody always talks about is data privacy and data security, right? Before I ask each of you some specific questions in regard to your own companies, with the rise of patient privacy laws worldwide, so we have PDPA in Singapore, GDPR in Europe and applicable to Singapore, HIPAA in the US, PIPA in South Korea, and a whole lot more, right? What are some of the key things, maybe 1, 2, or 3 key things each of you could share with the audience that you have ensured your solution, has kind of conformed or ticked the box? What advice would you give anyone to start?
Start with the CTO.
All right. Well, when it comes to privacy laws, we pursued it very early on, and we've adopted a certain privacy policy and information policy within the company where de-identified data was the key in how we dealt or moved or manipulated data or stored data. So we took privacy very seriously from early on, and we designed our information systems to rely and to guarantee from the very beginning that that data was identified and the privacy of the users were respected. When it comes to GDPR, again, pursued it very early on. Europe is one of our major markets, so it was absolutely necessary for us to pursue it. Again, we're seeking regulatory approval with the NHS, for example. And NHS's framework is also very dependent on the GDPR regulation since they just Brexited. It's still a legacy in some ways. And of course, there's overhauls to how medical devices are regulated as well. So privacy was something that we built into our information systems from the very beginning.
Maureen, Tanyan?
I mean, I can build on that. I think that we have a similar philosophy, right? Like where luckily, we started and formed the company in Singapore, which has some of the highest privacy laws in the world. Like you said, the PDPA compliance here, and that wasn't a requirement to do any of our clinical trials anyway. So I think that similar to you guys in Mobio, it was a front and center in terms of building our company and the platform that we have and our tech stack. Likewise, I think that given that PDPA is such a robust governance framework, it's allowed us to actually accelerate some of our, when we're thinking about market expansion into the likes of Korea or into Europe, then we seem to be almost there, right? There's a few little changes that need to happen, but same with you, we focused on anonymization and de-identifying all of our patient information.
Yeah, so I really echo what both of you said. I think privacy and security of healthcare data is very important. At Hallmark, we work with a lot of clinical data. So we pull a lot of data from various electronic medical records, both our own software or software that is used by other healthcare providers throughout the world, in the US, in Europe, and here in Asia as well. And I think picking on one key thing that you mentioned is really about the anonymization of data. I think that's one thing that has really helped us is that we spend quite a bit of time to really build that anonymizer that allows us to work with data from other healthcare systems or healthcare provider systems that have very clearly very key concerns about their patient data. They want to use their data, but they are very concerned about privacy and security. But how do you help them help them overcome these barriers in terms of really unlocking the value of data? And that, I think this was one very key element, being able to show very confidently we were able to de-identify all of this data, because for the analytics that we do, we don't actually require any identifiable data.
Maybe I'll go a little bit off tangent, but still within data. Each of you keep mentioning clinical data or medical data, right? I'm sure all three of you are familiar with the term social determinants of health. Mm-hmm. Yes? Not so, okay. So social determinants of health, long debated in the past, now no longer debated. Social determinants of health, essentially, I should tell you, it's no longer about your genetic code, but about your postcode. So the social determinants of health, where you live, what you eat, how much you make, your education level, the pollution around you, these are the most important determinants of one's health outcome, not medical data. So not data that you get in your hospital, from your doctor, from your clinic, right? Have any of your companies started to look at that? Because in many ways, the value of non-medical data, which is actually medical data, has been underestimated. Any thoughts, comments, and is this something that your companies are looking at?
I would say that at this stage, no. I think the reason is we're still trying to understand how this data is being captured, and how do you make sense of the data that's being captured. I think there are not many avenues that actually is able to capture some of these things. And I mean, by social determinants of health, I would, like you said, location where you stay in, how does that correlate to, say, perhaps your socioeconomic status? Yeah. I think we're not working directly with such data, but for us, any kind of data is valuable. And I can totally see a future where all of this data provides a much richer insight to that particular patient, in both how he might respond to a particular kind of treatment, but really also what could be most suitable for him. But at this stage, not yet, but very interesting.
Yeah, fair enough. Right?
Yeah, so I think at Cognient, I mean, that's the premise in which we've built our company, right? In terms of passively collecting digital biomarkers that exist within your phone. So a lot of that is location data, for instance. Yeah. We're able to track your movement, your executive function, actively track your speech input, your ocular motive. I think that at this stage, we combine that with clinical data from, your PH9 score from your psychologist, for instance, and then we can correlate your relapse prediction. I think that the data, if we want to call it a data set, around that non-clinical data is super important. I don't think that, to your earlier point, I don't think that we understand actually the value of that at the moment, but it's definitely something that we have focused on in terms of our product suite.
I'm going to ask you a follow-on question, because this is one of the things I wanted to ask you about Cognient. So your app, Sally, utilizes native mobile phone sensors, call and text patterns, location sensors to establish digital phenotypes and screen for behavioral disorders, among other issues, right? So in the context of consumer privacy, and we'll come to some of the audience questions later, in the context of consumer privacy, you said you've got 2 trials in Singapore as well, right? How have you found the consumer response towards such tracking? I mean, I'm guessing that they've obviously agreed if it's on a trial. And are people actually willing to enable their privacy settings to allow you to track their personal habits? What comments or feedback have you got from consumers on this point? And what methods do you or Cognient find most effective in convincing consumers to actually allow this tracking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So we're a B2B2C, meaning that anyone that uses our platform from a consumer's perspective has been onboarded by their clinician.
So when your middle B is clinician, not insurer, not another party.
So we are clinician, and in the future it will be biopharma. So really everything that we do is with patient consent. So the patient consents to the passive data collection and also the active data collection, because with the app, the patient companion app, you're actually able to actively enter your thoughts, your mood, what you've eaten. And so they consent to that. In terms of resistance, generally it's built off the back of that relationship that they have with their clinician already. So there hasn't been a lot of pushback. or if any pushback. So the people that are on our platform at the moment have been onboarded through their clinician, and we know that they use our platform, at least the clinicians use our platform 100% of the time, and there's no churn. With patients, depending on the interactions, because there's cognitive behavior therapy built into the platform, there's an education, there's a tracking, there's a monitoring tool. So it's to varied degrees of interactions with that tool, but no real resistance.
Okay, interesting. Maybe one more question for you, Maureen. Various reports have cited various numbers in terms of hospital stays that are potentially preventable, right?
Yeah.
Low percentage all the way to 20, 30, 40%, depending on what reports you read. So how do you ensure that your consumer or patient actively continues their therapy, so is compliant, so as to reduce such preventable occurrences? Same problem with pharma, right? How do we ensure patients are, it's the holy grail that no one's cracked?
Yeah.
In your case, any thoughts or comments on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess to my earlier point around the philosophy of how we built the company was that we understand that patients at the moment are only treated when they're in a clinical setting. And so we have built, and so then that also reduces the compliance, right? Because as soon as they leave that clinical setting, they might have an interaction. If they're if someone is having, is actively engaged with their psychologist, for instance, they might see them every 2 weeks for, 45 minutes to an hour in terms of the consult. So our platform allows us to provide that stickiness between those clinical visits. So when they are not in that clinical visit, the Sally companion app tracks and monitors what they're doing, but also it encourages and has nudge theory built into it to support their actual compliance. So we have medication reminders built into the platform, and the doctor or the clinical admin can actually push some notifications to that patient as well in order to them to fill out, the standardized assessments. We see that in terms of reinforcing their already clinical workflow with their clinicians.
Okay. Avi, might move to something less clinical. Interesting question for you. Now, you look young, so this is an assumption, right? So as a fairly young, or at least young-looking CTO, in the Asian context, how have you navigated the position of leadership? I'm sure people in your team, as well as external stakeholders and clients you meet, might be older or more experienced than you. Mm-hmm. Has it been daunting? Have you, any tips? Because we see a lot of young entrepreneurs leading organizations today.
Well, I'm in my mid-20s, and there's a certain advantage that comes with being in your mid-20s, which is an incredible amount of energy. And I think people need to...
You're trying to say us oldies don't have energy today?
And what comes naturally, I think, with being in your 20s is a distinct natural curiosity and an ability to learn very quickly. If one is young and is interested in absorbing everything around them, it's very possible to do. So one of the things that I do is I listen and absorb as much as I can. Now, when it comes to decision making, this is where the key differentiator is. I rely on the experiences of others. I'm mentored by my CEO, Bashar Assab. I'm mentored by a lot of people who have had years and years of experience, and they guide me through my decision-making process. So I gather the information, I bring it to them, and we help understand or refine the decision-making process that a CTO has to go through.
Interesting. Okay. And what about Singapore? How long have you been in Singapore now?
A few months.
So impressions of Singapore. I don't know if the majority of people watching are from Singapore. I assume they are. Mm-hmm. Be candid. What are your impressions of Singapore? And specifically, as an aspiring deep tech hub, I'm sure you've read in the newspaper and heard in the news, this term keeps getting thrown around in the last 6 months, deep tech, focus on deep tech. What do you feel about Singapore being a deep tech hub? And do you find that we have enough talent here? Candid answer.
Well, the way that one builds talent in a place like Singapore, and it's in a lot of places where it's not quite there. It has the necessary infrastructure in terms of education. It has the necessary infrastructure in terms of governance support, right? The next step is...
And finances.
And finance, of course. but also smart finance is important too. So there needs to be a level of experience in terms of investor when they know which companies to put in, which companies to back, which companies to support, which entrepreneurs to push forward. And that thing is basically unique to do. There's no replacement for that. So if Singapore wants to become a deep tech hub, it needs to keep iterating and doing and failing sometimes, but keeping at it. That's how you develop human capital. That's how you develop experience, skill set. That's how you develop networks and communities, which are really what form a deep tech hub. It's not just having the talent. It's not just having the money or just having the technology. It's all these things working in a synchronous and harmonized manner. It's about managing expectations and managing tolerance for risk. It's developing experience with failure. Very, very important for a deep tech hub. People need to become very comfortable with that. Right? And it's a very necessary kind of cultural change that needs to happen from what I've seen in Singapore. This desire to take risks, this desire to build things and to fail and to build it again.
Very neutral answer. Teng-Yan,
Sure.
in terms of Hallmark, you mentioned that you guys are aspiring to be, the largest repository of data, real world evidence for mental health, right, in the future. So with such a large repository as you grow, right, that you're obviously collecting from multiple sources, right? Tell us, how do you ensure a few things? Integrity of data, the accuracy of it, the uniformity of it, which is, I think, a big problem, especially being a clinician. I can tell you, we doctors are horrible in the way we document things sometimes, and we're all different, right? So the uniformity, and lastly, the security. I think the security we've touched on already. So the integrity, accuracy, and uniformity. How do you deal with that?
Sure. I mean, very big questions, but maybe I'll just share a little bit about how we think about data at Hallmark. You're right, we capture a huge variety of different data. For example, in just our own existing clinical database, we have about patient data of about 550,000 patients over a longitudinal period of about 20 years, right, of patients with psychiatric conditions. And for us at Hallmark, the value and hub of us at Hallmark is really around the data. And so we are constantly building data pipelines that feed into this database. This may be not just from our own software, but also from other hospital electronic medical record system. And so you can imagine we're pulling all different kinds of data.
Just on that, when you say software, is it homegrown software or do you partner with others?
So we have our own specialty electronic medical records that's being used by 30 hospitals and clinics globally. So we own that, but that's not enough for us. We want to constantly grow our data at least at a rate of 1 million patients per year. And so that's where we have to form what we call data partnerships with other healthcare provider systems and pull that data from the electronic medical records. So I like to say it's magic in terms of making all this happen, but actually it's a lot of hard work. And basically, just to give you an example, when we first started to work with our own electronic medical record software, it took us probably about 2.5 years of our data scientists as well as clinical experts to really go very deep into the data, trying to understand each field. And of course, as typically with electronic medical record data, the data is very messy. There are a lot of gaps. There are a lot of repetitive columns with just slight differences, and how do you mesh them all together? So I think it came from a lot of, we had to do a lot of manual effort to make sure, clean up the data, basically form it in a way that's analyzable. And then that helps to really make all of that data uniform. And the same thing, as we work with any other new electronic record software, as we pull this data into our database, we make sure that it conforms to these certain both standards as well as columns, so that it sort of like matches up into our overall database. And that's really where a lot of the analytics can happen. Once you have that clean, organized database, then you can lay upon analytical tools that allow you to really develop insights. I think that's really at the stage that we are at. Looking for very interesting questions you can solve with the data. Just as an example, I think one very key kind of data that we often work with is a lot of unstructured data that actually comes of clinician patient records and notes. And that's actually one of the key sources of data, because we don't have blood tests, we don't have imaging studies or so. So how can we, say, predict a patient's severity of disease or severity of their condition just by seeing what are the notes that the doctor types out, which is often in a typically very story-based kind of like format.
Unstructured.
Unstructured
That's
kind
why I'm
of format.
saying sorry.
So, yeah. So it's created a lot of challenges, but I think that's where we can really bring that value.
I'm a huge believer in partnerships and collaboration, right? Are there any particular partners, don't have to name the actual partners, but categories over the journey that Hallmark has taken, it's been a number of years now, right? That you feel are more integral in regard to successful commercialization. So whether it's pharma partners, medtech partners, or even data players, there are a number of data players out there who have platforms to help you, right? Are there any one or two stakeholders who have been more integral?
From a commercialization perspective, I would say it's the pharmas that we have been able to work with. And part of the reason is that we've had a huge amount of interest coming from them, because I think farmers understand
they provide the data.
They do not provide the data, but they're very interested in the insights from the data.
But they would also have data. Is it a mutual thing? Do they also share their data with you or no?
If they have their own data, yes, they can actually use our platform to bring the data into our platform and actually use it as well. But we have our own data sources that they can actually use as well. Exactly.
You're nodding. You want to add something to that comment?
Oh, no, I think the pharma plays a really important role. I think for Cognient, we're a slightly earlier stage than you guys. I think for us, probably the partnerships that have been really critical have been our academic partnerships with some of the leading research when it comes to,
because of that clinical validation.
Mental health and brain and neurology. So I think for us, that's been really critical in terms of accelerating our commercialization. But I think data is key, right?
Last question for you before we move on to some audience questions. Hallmark is the most mature of the three up here today, okay? Again, contentious question I'm going to ask you, right? Try to be candid. Which country in Southeast Asia or globally have you found the most resistance and difficulty with in terms of going to market and commercializing? But I'd also like to ask you, has Singapore been the easiest? So maybe has Singapore been the easiest, yes or no? And then tell us which country geographically has been the most difficult.
Sure. I think from a commercialization perspective, I think Singapore, I would not say it has been the easiest market, but it's been a very natural market for us.
Okay, of course.
Here in Singapore, we have very direct access to government agencies. So let me prod
a little bit, right? Okay, it's not been the easiest market. So what do we need to do here to make it easier for startups like yourself? Because being on the corporate side, I work with a lot of companies, right? And we see a lot of countries much further ahead, right? And it begs the question, well, why? What do we need to do? So you being in that seat, what do we need to do as Singapore to make it easier for companies like all three of you?
Sure. I think probably two things jump up to me first. I think it's something what Avi mentioned as well. I think firstly, regulations. I think there needs to be very clear guidance from our regulators on what is acceptable, what do we need to do, especially in the space of
but that's AI. Been worked on, right?
It's been worked on, but
space, so.
Right. It's been worked on, but I feel like from a Singapore perspective, I'm just going to be a bit candid. I feel like we're a bit more reactive rather than active. We've been a bit more conservative. We've been looking at what happens in the US and trying to model after some of that. And I think what I see regulators are doing their part, and they're trying to catch up as well. But it's always that tension between innovation. I think the second part is really about mindset shifts and willingness to take risk. As we work with especially many stakeholders in this space, including clinicians. I think there are a lot of very forward-thinking clinicians who really want to try new ways, new models of care. But there is always a resistance, right? When you try to change something, trying to inculcate a new way of diagnosing patients.
So what do we need to do?
So I think it's really, I'm not sure. I don't have the solution. I can lay out what the problem is. I wish I knew what the solution is. I think it's probably a series of combination of education, better relaxation of some of the rules in terms of innovation that encourages that. Of course, funding, I think, is key to really encourage more companies who want to try new things in this space. I don't have a one-size-fits-all solution.
You've been here too short of time. Do you have anything to add before we move to
I think really good points. Maybe just to add, I think that we really need to be objective about how Singapore fits into the wider ecosystem. And that is, Singapore is a great incubator of startups, right? And they've got, you know, the relationships with the likes of A-Star and Enterprise Singapore really investing in the ecosystem here amongst, a huge amount of others. Yep. You know, they've got programs like Scalar8. They're bringing startups to, you know, Europe. They've got NextCube that's bringing up
226 accelerators/incubators in Singapore alone.
Wow. So like amazing, right? And I think that we as startups need to, well, at least for us, we need to acknowledge and be objective about how we use Singapore. So for us, we're really using it as an incubator to test, refine, really kind of build our product, but in order to take it to the rest of the world, right? And Singapore's always been amazing at doing that. They've always been the conduit to something else. So if you think about, you know, the National Electronic Health Record, it was the first of its kind, and I was lucky to work on it in a previous life, building out that technology here, and then that was replicated in Australia, then parts of that was replicated in the NHS. I think that we've always played that role as Singaporeans, is being an incubator and being the first to be kind of at the frontier of some of these products, but with the understanding that it's a launching pad to somewhere else. Because here, I mean, with a population of 6 or 7 million, we're never going to have the numbers for companies to grow and be successful if they're only going to operate in Singapore.
Okay. Let's move to some audience questions because we have about just under 15 minutes left. So I think the first question I'd like to pick up there, I saw question number 4. Have we seen the same effectiveness of virtual mental health clinics in comparison with traditional face-to-face? And I'll let all of you go, but I've seen the data myself. And the short answer is actually yes. We've seen the same effectiveness, and I would go as far as to say even better effectiveness. With you guys, with Mobio data that I've seen, certainly it's better than even face-to-face. You want to add to that? And maybe I'll let both of you, since all 3 of you have done clinical trials and validation. Any thoughts on this?
As I mentioned, the effectiveness rate of, let's say, in-person psychotherapy is still 30%. And of course, the cost and accessibility means that the overall aggregate effect for society is still very limited by that. So the advantage of virtual clinics beyond the effectiveness is also the advantage of scalability and accessibility. It's the advantage of moving quickly and refining our processes so as to meet changes in the environment. In this case, for example, COVID was something that happened almost instantly. Overnight, the world changed, right? And being digital, being virtual, it gives us the advantage to react quickly and deliver the care that people need in that case. Right? There are several other advantages beyond effectiveness.
Maureen?
Yeah, and just to echo that, I think that we don't have the problem of accessibility in Singapore because we live in a city country.
Sometimes we do.
Well, I've never had the problem of accessibility in Singapore, but I definitely do think, you know, to build on your point, I think that accessibility, like virtual, allows you to be accessible, scalable, affordable to a much broader patient cohort.
So, I mean, in our experience, I think with the right patient group, yes, definitely as effective or even more effective. I'll just throw a counterpoint to this question is that there are still quite a number of patients, especially in the psychiatric space, that are resistant to these. They don't want to speak to a doctor through a phone. They want to be in person, and that group of patients aren't going to be benefiting, at least at this stage, until that mindset changes.
In fact, you mentioned, you know, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this new social media platform, Clubhouse. I've been on it for the last 2 weeks and listening, and I just heard something very interesting. Audio-only teleconsultations. So it was very interesting, and I was thinking, now the person speaking was a dermatologist, and so I have no idea how you do a audio-only teleconsultation with dermatology, but he said that they send a picture of the skin to him. But actually, that's a great point. Mental health might be one of those areas where an audio-only could work. So it's an interesting space.
Interesting though. I mean, just on that, I mean, we're speaking to a lot of therapists as well, and they've also told us that actually being able to see the patient's facial expressions actually is also very important for effectiveness.
But at the end of the day, there's still something that you can do because it is a lot of listening and communication with mental health. If we could just remove that question so we can read all the other questions, please. Shrikant asked a good question as well. Shrikant, I think we've touched on your second point, the cybersecurity requirements, so we won't ask that, but his question is, how do you see, if any, uptake of digital therapeutics. And I'm glad he used this term. I wanted to bring it up, SAMD. I'm not sure how many of our audience are familiar with this, software as a medical device. This is a new area. Well, not so new. It's been around for a number of years in the US, but this term, software as a medical device. So how do you see, if any, the uptake of digital therapeutics in Singapore, utilization in mainstream clinical practice? Again, I don't know if Avi might not have too much given he's just been here a few months, but Teng Yan, Maureen, any thoughts on this? Uptake in mainstream clinical practice?
I would say that there are probably a number of hoops to jump through before it goes into mainstream clinical practice. So, for example, I think we've been talking a lot over the last 30 minutes about clinical trials and getting validation. But I think that's only actually the beginning. There's only one step of the process. Even if you are able to show that, say, a digital therapeutic has a certain effectiveness on patients, then the next question comes, what is that level of effectiveness compared to existing therapies? How does it add on to existing management tools? How does that impact workflows of doctors? How does that make therapy? We need to think about things like cost effectiveness. We need to think about the economics of delivering something like this as well. So I think there are many different things to go through. I feel like we're probably still at the beginning. Like say in a 10-mile race, we're probably just at the second or third mile, so there is a way to go. But I think with technology, things often progress a lot faster than we imagine, so could be pretty quick.
Maureen, anything to add to that? Uptake?
No, I'm pretty aligned. I think that there's a long way to go, but you know, hopefully it becomes part of you know, the standardized clinical workflow. I definitely do think that we can't ever underestimate the change management that needs to happen around that and the behavior change of the doctors in order to uptake, you know, digital therapeutics.
I think I want to share my perspective as well, because I'm a practicing clinician still, but I'm also on the corporate side with PwC. So I work with all the different stakeholders. And Shrikant, what I see this is a very interesting question, because this is a question we see amongst clinicians a lot and amongst government and some of the government entities that are trying to address this. And the clinicians on one hand will say, well, we're limited by regulations and we want to, but we're afraid, and liability, etc. And on the other hand, you know, government entities will say, actually, we want to put forth the agenda, but it's the clinicians who are hesitant. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg. So I don't think we will come to a conclusion, but certainly I think all of us up here feel that at some point it will be mainstream clinical practice, at least to a certain extent.
And I actually think the push will come from the patients.
Correct, exactly.
And their demand.
So I was actually going to go to that on Josephine's next question, who's asked, in terms of data, are there plans to centralize and democratize patient data between various clinicians and or pharma to maximize its potential? And if so, how? I might take a stab at this if that's okay before I open it to my colleagues here. Josephine, I would put it back to you and say, actually, does it matter if there are plans or not? And I say that because, to Maureen's point, it is ultimately what the consumer and patients are going to want. And I always say a line that many of my colleagues think I'm crazy for saying, and it's essentially that electronic medical records and national health records will no longer exist in 5 to 10 years' time. What will exist are personal health records, where the patient carries it with them and provides access to the provider or to whoever on their terms and conditions. So I don't think that question is really applicable, but would love to hear my colleagues' thoughts up here. Are there plans to centralize and democratize patient data between different stakeholders?
I just think, what's the incentivization for any of those stakeholders to do that?
So because there's no incentivization, you don't think it will happen?
Yeah, I think that, to your point, I think that people will end up owning their own data sets and their own like medical records, and they will determine how and where they want that information to flow.
It's very interesting, this point, because a lot of people are now aware of the value of data from a monetary perspective, but unfortunately they don't realize that their data in isolation is not what a pharma company is going to pay for, or a provider is going to pay for. It's the data in as
Data
a
sets.
sum, right? It's data sets, exactly. But to this question, Tengyan, Avi, any comments to Josephine's question on this? Centralization and democratization?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is like one of the top healthcare IT challenges, right? The interoperability of data. And, the last 15, 20 years, we've not been able to really tackle that very well. I think one of the challenges what I see is really trying to bring all this data together is actually an infrastructure challenge. It's really building those tools that allow these different systems to communicate with each other, because there's just such diversity in different softwares that are being used by different clinics. We've started to explore some of this in Singapore. How can we potentially, say, pull in mental health data from not just the hospitals or IMH, but even from, say, the polyclinics and the GP setting. But as we plan this out, it's a huge infrastructure project to do so. So I think that's one of the key challenges.
Okay. We might wrap up with the last couple of questions from the audience, and then I'm going to ask each of you a take-home message, and then we can just summarize this evening's session. Ira has asked, mental health has to become a publicly accepted topic to talk about, as in many cultures it is seen as weakness. Absolutely right. Don't think anyone here disagrees with that statement. How do you intend, maybe the question should be, how should awareness to cultures be raised when mental health is seen as such? I mean, Ira, from a Singapore perspective, the government has clearly articulated mental health as one of their key focus areas. So, they've done a great job as a government to say, look, this is a problem and we need to focus on it. So hopefully that's a start. Any suggestions or ideas from the three of you of how to raise awareness and improve things?
I think it starts from leadership and starts from the top. For example, in some of the work, we also work with organizations and corporates in terms of helping them to improve the mental wellness of the organization using some of our tools. And I think when leaders in a particular organization are able to speak openly about these issues, that sets the example for others to want to follow and start to speak up as well. So I feel like that's probably one thing. I was speaking from a corporate organization's perspective, but I think this can actually also apply in general.
Great point. Anything from either of you?
I mean, I think that COVID, apart from the destruction and the impact that it's had on the world, it's been a really great vehicle, let's call it, for lack of a better word, to really start highlighting mental health and the impact that mental health has on individuals, on organizations, on companies, on families. And so I think that the movement is already here. How do we try to accelerate that? I think through Cognient, what we are doing is it's passively allowing people to manage their own and empowering individuals to manage their own mental health conditions in their own home setting, or anywhere for that matter. So I think that allows an element of self-control, which I think often is not associated with mental health. Actually, it's a loss of control.
I'll add a few words. I think a lot of the points mentioned are absolutely valid. There's one more thing to consider, and I think it's how mental health is being treated in terms of the people who are dealing with the issues of mental health, such as ourselves. Quantifiable real-world evidence, treating it with the utmost seriousness, and also meeting the need that's been created with COVID. We can show as industry leaders that we can rise to the challenge, that there is an actual issue, that we can quantify it, that we can measure it, and that we can deal with it effectively. Then I think this will garner, this will change public opinion for good.
Great points from all of you. I think it's also about big government bodies or agencies like WHO who have actively added diagnoses like burnout to their ICD-11 criteria to help get that message across. So I think I'm just going to ask each of you two last quick questions before summing this session up. Okay. From an investor perspective, because there are investors watching this, right? I know you guys raised recently, but you can still provide a response if you like. From an investor perspective, especially Maureen, Avi, you guys are in active fundraising mode. Is there anything in particular that you are looking for in your investors that you'd like to share with them?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, at Cognient, we are actively fundraising at the moment. I think for us at the stage of the company that we are at, our investors really need to be our partners. And for two reasons. I think that both from a ability to provide the growth mechanism in order to expand into other countries. So that might be through mentorship, it might be through their networks, it might be through their expertise. And the second is that we are looking for investors to that last point that have either health tech or mental health experience or neurological experience in terms of being an investor and a partner that will allow us to not only invest in us in seed, but also in Series A and Series B. So really be, for lack of a better word, a catalyst in terms of supporting our growth at Cognient.
For Mobile Interactive, we're not currently in fundraising mode, but we will be, I think, fairly soon. The thing that we're really looking for in the upcoming funding rounds would be the necessary sophistication on behalf of our investors to really take this product where it needs to be, right? It's a very complex area. There's a lot of regulatory hurdles. There's a lot of challenges, especially since mobile is approaching it on a very global scale in some ways. We're in several markets at the same time. So what we need from our investors is support our partnership model that we've built. Our go-to-market strategy is very partnership heavy. So that being able to support that kind of strategy and having the sophistication and the expertise to support this global growth in some ways. Right?
Can I ask you a question? What do you mean by sophistication?
Well, what you mentioned, experience is one way of having sophistication, but also like an extremely thorough understanding of the market.
Of the markets, yeah.
A narrow focus on the space that we're in. Right.
Do you want to add anything?
Sure. I guess just a quick point. Exactly everything is relevant, and that is probably why we were really excited when we raised our last round of funding with Optum Ventures as well as Health Catalyst Capital. And the reason is because when we look for an investor, we're looking for strategic partners, people who really understand healthcare data. They understand the value that potentially can come with this data. They potentially can allow us to build upon our data partnerships and bring more data into the system for us to work with. But more importantly, also understand that the play that we're all making over here is a long-term play. It's not a short-term thing that you are here to cash out after 3 years or 5 years, but know that we're building a whole new world, a whole new generation of how medical treatments are going to be delivered. And being aligned with that philosophy, I think is very important.
Great point. So to wrap it up, guys, I'd like each of you to share one take-home message for the audience, and I'm going to share my summary of 3. Who wants to go first? One take-home message. Ladies first.
I think that, clinical validation is really key to be
you
able
took mine.
to really, redefine healthcare through technology. And I think that all 3 of us, actually, the companies are really spearheading a lot of the validation that's happening in that space. So in order to redefine, healthcare, we need to think about clinical validation and the support that technology allows us to drive that innovation.
Okay. Avi, one take-home point?
I'll just share a way that I think about it. I don't have a background in life sciences. I have a background in computer science. And one of the ways that I think about digital health is that the human brain is a circuit as well. Right? And we have these circuits everywhere. We have them in our hands. They're part of our lives. And in some ways now, what is digital moves the molecules in our own heads, right? When people are scrolling mindlessly through social media, they're building habits, they're building behaviors, they're building perspectives. So we have these things, these circuits that redefine the circuits in our own heads. And it's time that we started. I know it's much more of an effort to get to actually use this to solve mental illness or to help people's lives, but it's time we started using this technology for positive reasons. Right? It's great that we've managed to hack human behavior and get them to scroll mindlessly, but we can do other things with this. And the potential is untapped yet, right?
Yeah.
There's no cap on what we can do.
Okay.
How much we can improve people's lives.
Tang Yan,
Sure. I
wrap
mean,
up your one take-home message.
my message would probably be very simple. I think mental health is a huge space. So many problems in this space. And I would really love for more people to come in and innovate in this space. Because you will find that while it's inherently very challenging, when you're actually able to solve some problems, it's really very, very gratifying.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to share 4 points, 2 of which my colleagues here have already said. I really like your quote, and I'm going to attribute it to you. Mental health is the cancer of tomorrow. I think that's a powerful line. First message. Second message, clinical validation is a real challenge, not just for mental health startups, but health tech startups in general, but is key to success and should be done early. Number 3, clearer regulations need to be in place. So hopefully that message gets to the right people. And then lastly, awareness of mental health, again from you, Tang Yan. Awareness of mental health must come from the top, must be filtered down by leadership in organizations to help raise awareness. So I think on that note, thank you very much to the 3 of you. This was a very interesting and fun session. Thank you all for listening in. And again, thank you for Catalyst for hosting us as always. This brings the 4th of a 4-part series to a close. We will be coming up with a new series, so stay tuned. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.